You know how much. Oh, sorry. I'll make them go again. Okay, let's see what you remember. The area of platyhelminthes are those minocytes. The area, that one should be pretty obvious. Flame bulbs or flame cells. Platyhelminthes, what do they do for platyhelminthes? What is their function? They're doing it, helping to get rid of waste, pulling water through to get rid of waste. Anthozoans. Cnidaria, those are anemones and stuff like that. Remember, that means flower animals. Regeneration. The P ones, platyhelminthes. Remember, we're going to cut them up in half and they're going to regenerate theoretically. Cephalization. Who has cephalization? Platyhelminthes, I would think we would say. Remember, we talked about the nerve nets. There's some like gathering of nerve sensory stuff in cnidarians, but not really true cephalization. Triploblastic. Platyhelminthes only. Corals. Cnidaria. Radial symmetry. Cnidaria. Bilateral symmetry. Platyhelminthes. Sexual reproduction. That's the only one I have to go. There's the answers. So those are your answers. I am going to post this PowerPoint only because we're going to talk about these next couple slides. Before we get into what we have to do, your test is next Monday. It's on chapters 31 to 33. So I wanted to talk a little bit about studying for a test. I know you just came back from break and you don't necessarily want to think about studying for a test, and maybe you didn't study for a test over break, and I get that. I did not grade as much as I should have over break. The test format will be similar to your last test. So some multiple choice, some short answer, probably some diagrams that you're labeling and answering questions about. You have 7 nights to study 3 chapters. So if you want to divide up your time, that means you have 2 nights for each chapter to study, and then next Sunday you can study all of them. Block out a time to study every day. I know that you've heard this before. I know that as an adult, when I know that I need to do something more regularly, I don't always do it either, and I wait until the last minute. That's why it's important to block out the time now and say, okay, today is Monday, and today I'm going to study chapter 31 from X time to X time. And then you actually have to do that. You can't just block out the time and then not do it. Chapter 31 is fungi, so you need to know things like the general features of the kingdom. There are some 3 life cycles on the PowerPoint, but those are the ones that you need to focus on. Print out those life cycles and practice labeling them. Take the labels off, label them. The more active studying you can do, the better off I think you are. Just looking at the PowerPoints and looking at your notes is not that it's not helpful, because that is helpful, but the more that you can do that is active, like actually requiring you to do stuff, the better it's going to get in your head. Remember, we talked about writing things down versus typing even. It's helpful. There are 5 phyla of fungi that you need to know. What are their characteristics that are unique to each phyla? Usually that characteristic is what is their sexual reproduction structure. Are they septate or coencytic or aseptate? Make a chart of these. Make flashcards. You have one from your lab that you might not have gotten back there. So make another chart. Okay, again, actively doing things, writing things down, I think is more helpful than just looking at the book and flipping through and looking at pictures. Not that that's not helpful, because that is. But the more that you can do that is active. Make yourself a chart. If you'd like to make a PowerPoint of pictures and make your own slides. If that's helpful to you, do that. Again, actively. What are the roles of fungi in the environment? And on your outlines at the bottom, there are always things that says like what to know or something. Make sure you cover something like that at the bottom of the outline. Look at those things, because those are the things that we're going to be looking for. For chapter 32, that was animal diversity. So again, what are the general characteristics of the animal kingdom? Developmental stages that we've talked about, body plans, the symmetry things. I think you guys have been doing a good job of understanding tissues. What kind of coelom do they have or not have? Are they diploblastic versus triploblastic? Protostome versus uterostomes. Developmentally, what is different? Can you compare and contrast those? There's a nice chart in the PowerPoint. Again, clear out that chart and see if you can fill it in on your own. Basic phylogenetics, you don't need to memorize that phylogenetic tree. There's one at the end of the chapter, you don't need to memorize that, but understanding how the phylogenetic tree shows the relationships, that's helpful to know. How to interpret the phylogenetic tree, and again, the outline at the end shows what to know. You don't need to worry about frantically trying to write all this down. I will post this, I promise. Okay, in chapter 33, which is the chapter we're on now, is the introduction to invertebrates. This is the bulk of the material. This is the biggest chapter. There's a lot. We have to get through a lot this week still. I counted pages and I was like, oh, here, last week we covered like 5 pages in 2 days and we've got 19 pages to go, but still I'm taking time to talk about this. Okay, so we talked about what are the 5 questions for the different phyla. How do they eat? How do they exchange gases? How do they get rid of waste? How do they move? How do they reproduce? Again, make a chart or make a flashcard for periphery. And these are the 5 answers to those 5 questions and practice. Yet actively studying is more beneficial, I think, than just looking at your notes, looking at the PowerPoints. Again, then there's a whole pile of phyla. Within those phyla, we're talking about divisions for some of them. Make flashcards, make a chart, make pretty pictures, draw pictures if that helps you. You have to learn what works for you too, because what works for you might not work for someone else. Maybe studying with other people works for you, maybe it doesn't. You need to figure that out, because sometimes for some people it's productive and for some people it's counterproductive because they get distracted. What are the characteristics of those phyla? What are the body plans? Again, basic phylogenetics, understanding those phylogenetic trees, how to interpret those. And the outline is not going to be due until next Wednesday. Your test is on Monday. I will just do the outline as part of your studying, even though we're not forcing you to turn it in. Do the outline as part of your studying. The point of that is to be helpful in your study. Okay. So I'll post this. Those are just some things I was thinking about over break and how to give you advice on studying. Again, I'm not always the best at doing things ahead of time, but I procrastinate too. But if you block out the time, even if it's a half an hour a day until Friday, that's still better than trying to spend 8 hours on Sunday afternoon trying to get it on your brain. Okay, your brain can only handle so much, and you have other classes too. It's not like this is your only class. I get that. Okay. So that being said, chapter 33 is coming, and we have to go fast. We've talked about periphery, Nadaria, and a little bit of platyhelminthes, and there's a whole bunch more to go. Some of these we're not going to talk about in as much detail, so you might not have the answers to all 5 of those questions, and that's okay. We started talking on Friday about the platyhelminthes. So we got through the basic, I think we answered all 5 of those questions. Yes, no? Did we answer all 5 of the questions? No? Okay, we talked about how they eat. How do they eat? What? We didn't talk about the eating. Didn't we talk about a branched gastrovascular cavity? Yes. So they're bringing food in and digesting it and spreading it through that branched gastrovascular cavity. So there's not like any more specifics than that necessarily. They have that long flat body, remember? So that branched vascular cavity lets nutrients get close enough that they can get to each cell by diffusion. They don't have any kind of true circulatory system or things like that. Gas exchange, we talked about being just diffusion again. Waste, we talked about the flame cells pulling water through to flush waste out. Did we talk about reproduction? Yes, they can reproduce asexually by regeneration, budding, fission, and then they can reproduce sexually also by fertilizing each other because they're hermaphroditic. So they have both sexes, but they can fertilize each other. And they can move because they can move. And you'll see them move. Okay, so we kind of went over the basics. We're going to talk about 2 different classes of platyhelminthes. Trematoads are the first one. I just didn't want that up there. Yes, I did. There we go. So trematoads are a class that has a really complex life cycle. These are parasitic platyhelminthes, and they usually have 2 hosts. What does that remind you of with protists? We talked about some parasites, parasitic protists that had complex life cycles. Malaria, remember, went through 2 organisms. Same kind of idea here. Humans or vertebrates are usually the main host, and then there's an intermediate host. So these are trematodes, and this is what we're going to be starting in lab. We're going to be starting animals this week, so we'll be looking at slides of some trematodes. So the larvae tend to develop in one host, and then the adults develop in another. This one is showing us one that lives in humans and snails. Okay, there isn't more there. Okay. So it starts with the trematode burrowing into a human host. So it burrows into the skin. This is water that's been contaminated. And the adults will get into, this is showing you the intestines. Oh dear. My handwriting did not improve over break, sorry. So they get into the blood vessels in the intestines, and then they can spread throughout the body. They can live for up to 40 years in a human host because they evade the immune system by mimicking the surface proteins on the cells. So some people are asymptomatic and can be infected for 40 years without knowing it. Some people are symptomatic, so they can get inflammation where the host enters. They can get blockages in their GI tract. So within the human, you can see here, there's separate sexes. So there's a male and a female, and the female lives in the groove of the male, and they do sexual reproduction inside the host. So the eggs are fertilized and then they are released. Because this is happening in the intestines, they're released in the waste and the feces. So then that can end up in a water supply where the eggs develop into a ciliated larva in the water, and the snails pick up those ciliated larvae. So the snail is what we call the intermediate host. So inside the snail, these larvae undergo asexual reproduction and form a new form of the larvae, which is motile. So that's released from the snail into the water, and that's the motile larva is what can burrow into the human host and start the whole process all over again. Yep, see, I can't spell it either. So this is showing you the life cycle of the trematode that causes schistosomiasis. There will not be a spelling test on this one. Schistosomiasis. This can affect 200 million people a year. And again, some people are asymptomatic for 40 years and some people have major GI issues from it.
That's just the name for like.
That's the name of what the disease that is caused, schistosomiasis. How lethal is it? I don't have a number on that. I don't know. I mean, it's a parasite. So again, most parasites are not trying to kill their hosts. I'll try to get a number for you. I just have an infection numbers, but I don't know how many people die from it. The second class of platyhelminthes that we're going to talk about are Sestota, class Sestota. And these are tapeworms. Tapeworms are interesting because they don't have any real mouth or GI system. They just latch onto the host and just directly absorb nutrients from the host. So they don't have to do their own digestion and getting food. They just latch onto a host and absorb directly from that host. So this is showing you a picture of the electron microscope picture of the scolex, which is the end. This is how they attach. The scolex is how they attach to their host. They're just kind of gross looking. So after the scolex, they have all these individual segments, which are called proglottids. So as they're absorbing nutrients, they're basically just adding on new sections, new proglottids, and that's where the sex organs are. So each segment contains sex organs, and those can just break off and be passed in the feces again. And so that's how they can move to new hosts. So the sections, these proglottids can just break off in the feces. They go to the next host. Often this is through, again, contamination of water. So it's passed to a lot of cattle, sheep, pigs, that kind of thing through contaminated water. And they can form these cysts in muscles, the muscles of those organisms. And then if you eat undercooked meat that has these cysts, that's how you can get a tapeworm. Again, some people have these with no knowledge that they have them. Really gigantic tapeworms in their intestines, and they don't know it necessarily until it gets enough, starts taking enough nutrients that they become malnourished. It's not pretty. When I was in college, I took ceramics and we had to make all these things, and I made this vase, and then I realized it looked like a tapeworm. I gave it to my mom. She still has it. It wasn't deliberate. Okay. So continuing to talk about Lophotrochozoans. What's a Lophotrochozoan? The Locophorates, which are the ciliated crown of ciliated tentacles they use for feeding. And the Trochophores. Trochophores. That's the larval stage that are free swimming with cilia. So this is actually a pretty new phylum. So this is a new phylum. It actually used to be called Rotifera. And this one is different in my edition of the book than your edition of the book. So when we say it's a new phylum, it's, again, all these are shifting as we learn more molecular and DNA evidence. We have shifted our relationships, and it's way different than when I was in college many years ago. The classification is totally different than it used to be. So these are the rotifers. I want the picture. There we go. They're really, really small little animals. They're still multicellular, but they're tiny, microscopic little guys. And we will look at these in lab, assuming they come like they're supposed to tomorrow. Rotifers means wheel animals. So they have this little crown of cilia around their mouth that beat and looks kind of like a wheel. They do have a true digestive tract. So they have a tube with a mouth and an anus. So this is their mouth and their anus. So they're just bringing that food in. They are pseudocoelomates. What does that mean? False coelom. So remember, the mesoderm doesn't completely line the coelom. So they move nutrients around their body just by moving. They're small enough that them moving around moves things around their body. And again, they have these cilia to bring the food in, and then they have these jaws that they use to crush their food and grind it up. What makes them super interesting, maybe you're not super interested in them yet, they're really cute. But what makes them super interesting is that they can undergo parthenogenesis. Does anyone know what parthenogenesis means? It is a female, yes, laying unfertilized eggs that develop into functional females. The female lays fertilized eggs that can develop into another female. So usually with sexual reproduction, you need both male and female because you need to be diploid. These females can lay for unfertilized eggs, so the eggs don't have to be fertilized. They're still diploid and they become full functional females. Yes, and they're exactly identical to their mother. So it's not really sexual. Yes, only females.
Would you consider that like asexual reproduction?
Yeah. But they also are capable of sexual reproduction. So they often do asexual they do parthenogenesis. If situations are not good, if conditions are not good, but they can do sexual reproduction as well. Some species, though, don't even have males. Like there's no male that exists because they rely only on parthenogenesis to produce more offspring. So they have an unusual reproductive cycle. This one we've got a picture of too. We also are going to talk about very briefly Acanthocephalons, which are spiny headed worms. Referring to this end of the organism. These are parasites, as you can kind of tell because they look like parasites. They look creepy. Again, they also have complex life cycles. They often have lots of hosts. Their defining characteristic, and all we're really going to talk about with them, is that they have this proboscis with the hooks on it, which is why it's called a spiny-headed worm. That's a U, sorry. Again, very, very small, but still they're animals because they need characteristics of being an animal instead of a protist. Okay, here comes some more fun words for you. Okay, within the Lophotrochozoans, there's a subgroup called the Locophorates. These are ones that have the lophophore, the ciliated tentacles around their mouths. Okay, within there, we're going to talk about two phyla. The first one are the ectopracts. Okay, so all of these have a lophophore. Both of these phylums that we're going to talk about have the lophophore. They have the ciliated tentacles to bring the food into the mouth, to draw the water in. And then they have tentacles to get the food. They have a U-shaped alimentary canal. So not like a long straight tube. They don't have a head, so there's no cephalization in these two phyla. No concentrated sensory organs or nervous system. But they do have a true coelom. And these are things that you wouldn't even necessarily think are animals because they don't look like a stereotypical animal. The ectoprocts just kind of look like a moss. They're not a moss. They look like a moss, but they're not a moss. They are aquatic. And a lot of them have a hard skeleton, so they're important in coral reef ecology. They're reef builders. So they have a hard exoskeleton, and then the lophophores kind of come out from that exoskeleton. Whoops, I can't spell reef. They're important in building reefs. That's what I was afraid of. Why don't you? The second phylum are the Brachial Pads. And this is a brachiopod over here. What do they look like? Yeah, they look like a little clam. They're actually called lamp shells. But they have two shells just like a clam that are hinged to open and close like a clam, but the orientation is different. So their shells are dorsal ventral, so they are kind of up and down. A clam is lateral, side to side. They're sessile, so they're not moving anywhere. They just kind of anchor themselves to the seafloor or something else, and they're filter feeders. The Locophorates just sucks the water in and they can filter the food out that way. We're not going to answer all 5 questions about both of those phyla. Okay, this is just very basic little things to know. They are dorsal ventral, so top bottom versus side to side. This week or next week, I can't remember, we'll dissect clams in lab. But I can't remember if clams are this week or the following week.
Probably like opening them up from like closed shell.
Yes.
and then, like, doing something.
Yes,
If we find a pearl, can you give it?
that's an oyster, but yes, you could. They're challenging to open, and I don't eat clams, and dissecting them does not make me want to eat them anymore. We'll just say that. Speaking of clams, that's our next phylum. So we're going to spend a lot more time in the mollusk phylum. So what are some examples of mollusks? What do you know that's a mollusk?
What's called stuck flat shell? Yeah. Muscle.
Mussels are mollusks. What else do you know that's a mollusk? What? Cephalopods meaning like what? Yes, like octopus, squid. What else? Snails. It's a really diverse phylum. There's a lot of them. And there's a lot of different things about them. So we're going to talk about the general characteristics, and then we're going to talk about some of the different classes within the phylum. So snails, slugs, oysters, clams, octopus, squid, all of those fall into this category. They're still Lophotrochozoans. Mollusk means soft. So one of the characteristics is they have a soft body. Some of them have a shell. That's one of the things that helps to divide them into classes is their shell status. The number of shells and how they don't have one. So some of them have a shell, some of them do not. Some of them have an internal shell that's really small, and some of them have no shell at all. So slugs are mollusks, but they don't have a shell. But that shell obviously is protective of the soft body. So there's an advantage to having a shell. They are coelomates, so they have a true coelom. And they all have a similar body plan. And that's what you're seeing here. This is kind of a generalized body plan, which has 3 parts we'll talk about. Okay, so one part is the foot. This is a muscular foot. And what do you think they use it for? To move. Oh, I don't want that. No, stop. What are you doing now? There we go. Now, put it on right. Then they also have the visceral mass. And you can see the visceral mass is including all of these things, so this is what contains the internal organs. So while we're here, well, no, we'll come back to it. And then lastly, they have a mantle. The mantle goes over the visceral mass, and if there is a shell, this is what makes the shell. So it secretes the shell. If the shell is present, it just drapes. It's a tissue that drapes over the visceral mass. You can see in this case, it's kind of under the shell, in the shell layer, because it under the shell layer, it made that shell. Some of them have an organ called a radula. It's a rasping tongue. I don't know if you have a cat and you've ever felt your cat's tongue like the wrong way. It feels like sandpaper.
It does.
That's what I always think of as the radula as being like that. It just allows it to like scrape food off. So we have snails in our aquarium in the lab, and you can watch them like going along the side, eating the algae off the side of the aquarium. You can see their little radulas. They're scraping that algae off the side. So that leads us into the digestive tract. They do have a digestive tract. So they have a mouth, some kind of stomach, intestine, system, and an anus. So they have like a one-way digestive tract, tube within a tube. So they ingest food and then they digest it in their digestive tract. Okay, looking at this picture, how do you think they exchange gases? They have gills for gas exchange. Because we're answering all our 5 questions. So nutrients, gas exchange, waste. Looking at this picture, how do you think they get rid of waste? So some of the waste, anus, yes. Nitrogenous waste. They have metanephridium. Remember, nephro is kind of like kidney. So their metanephridium are the organs that they use to help get rid of nitrogenous waste. So when we talk about getting rid of waste, nitrogenous waste is like, that's what you pee out. Okay, food waste is the whole anus. And nitrogenous waste is the whole bladder, kidney bladder thing. Can they move? Yes, because they have a muscular foot. Most of them have separate sexes. For sexual reproduction, snails are an exception to this. They're hermaphrodites. But most of them have separate sexes. So they reproduce sexually, mostly with separate sexes. This is the first phylum that we're really talking about this. They have an open circulatory system. Okay, you have a closed circulatory system with the heart and blood vessels. They have an open circulatory system, so you can see they have a heart. And kind of a little bit of blood vessels. But it's more like an open cavity, but the heart helps to move fluid, and the fluid isn't really blood. It's hemolymph. So they have a heart, they have some short arteries, And then they have these body cavities, and the heart just helps move that hemolymph fluid throughout the body cavities so that it can transport materials that way. So this is the first one we really talked about having any kind of circulatory system, the first phylum, having any kind of circulatory system, but it's an open circulatory system, except for the exceptions that we'll talk about not having an open circulatory system, because we like to have exceptions to all our rules. There are 8 different clades within the mollusca phylum. We're only going to talk about 4 of them. Yay, you only have to learn about 4. Or boo, you only have to learn about 4. Depends on how you feel about mollusks. Oh, there are 93,000 known species of mollusks.
Whoa.
So we have 93,000 known species. It's the second most diverse phylum. Anyone know what the most diverse phylum is? We're getting there. Arthropods are the most diverse phylum that we know of. There are about 8,000 freshwater mollusk species and 28,000 land species, and then there's marine species. I didn't do the math. 50-some thousand species of marine mollusks. Okay, so let's start talking about our classes, our clades. So these are all classes within the phylum Mollusca. So we're starting with class Polyplacophora. These are not the most commonly known. These are chitins, not to be confused with chitin that makes up the cell wall of a fungus, because it has an O in it instead of an I. Totally different. We'll look at some of these in lab. They have an 8-plate shell body. That color didn't show up so well, sorry. Yeah, not so great. So they have 8 shell plates on their body. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Not that you can't count to 8. I just have a 3-year-old, so when we say things like that, we have to count them all. They do have a radula. I'm going to need this space in a minute. I'm going to regret writing that there. They eat algae in the ocean. They scrape it with their little radula tongue. And they have no body segmentation, meaning there's no like head, thorax, abdomen kind of thing, which we'll talk about more in the next one anyway. A different color. Oops. Second class, bivalvia. So Polyplacophora, sorry, going back, they have 8 shells. Poly means many. Placo is like the plates. Bivalvia, what do you think that means? 2 valves, 2 shells. I'm changing colors. So these are the clams and the mussels and the oysters. All of these are aquatic. And they have no real head either. So no true cephalization, although there might be some concentration of sensory organs, there's no true, like, this is the head, this is the not head. They have gills, they're filter feeders. And again, we'll dissect one of these in lab. It's probably this week.
This week?
I think it's this week, but I can't remember for sure. I shouldn't promise. It should be this week. Okay, gastropods. Gastro meaning stomach or eating foot. You can see, what are these?
Snail.
These are snails. So they have 1 shell, unless they're slugs. And it's a spiral shell. So they're kind of weird, and the way that they develop, they undergo what's called torsion. And so the visceral mass actually rotates so that the anus and the mantle are above the head.
It's called what again?
Torsion. Your book has a good diagram, a schematic showing it a little bit better than just looking at a picture of a snail. So they have a radula that they can use to eat plants or algae. Some of them are actually like parasitic, so they can bore holes into shells of other organisms. No, I can't read my own notes there. So some of these that are land organisms don't actually have gills. So some of the terrestrial gastropods don't have gills. The lining of their mantle cavity actually does gas exchange. So some of the land ones, the terrestrial ones, don't use gills for gas exchange. They have that lining of the mantle cavity for gas exchange. And cephalopods are the last ones, and we're not going to watch the video of them today. We'll have to wait until Wednesday. Cephalo meaning head, foot. So these are the most advanced, the most complex of the mollusks. A lot of cephalization. This is the octopus, the squid. These are marine predators, so they're saltwater. And they have tentacles to grasp their food, to bring it into their mouth. So to get food, they use their tentacles, and then they have a beak to help grasp and grind their food up.
That looks terrifying.
Some of them are absolutely terrifying. So in terms of a foot, they do have a foot. It's just part of their tentacles. So when we talk about the generalized body plan, we say they have a foot. Their foot is part of their tentacles. And then they have an excurrent siphon, which is what helps them to move. They can suck in water and then spit it back out to move themselves along. Most of them don't have a shell. If they do have a shell, it's internal. The exception to this is the chambered nautilus, which has a full shell and is a really odd organism. And we will finish talking about these on Wednesday. Okay, I will post this PowerPoint so that you have the study tips. Start studying today, because your test is next Monday.